I'm John Batchelor. I welcome my colleague, Professor John Yoo of Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as the Berkeley Law School, to comment on the War Powers Resolution, War Powers Act, effective November 7th, 1973, the closing of the Vietnam tragedy. This was enacted by the 93rd United States Congress, a joint resolution concerning the war powers of the chief executive. I read from the paragraph that describes it in general. War Powers Act is a federal law intended to check the U.S. president's power to commit the United States to an armed conflict without the consent of the U.S. Congress. The resolution was adopted in the form of a United States congressional joint resolution. It provides that the president can send the U.S. armed forces into action abroad only by Congress's, quote, statutory authorization, or in case of a, quote, national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces, end quote. Professor, a very good evening to you. Your presentation in the National Review Online, I recommend to everyone, because you're looking at all the instances since 1973, and we could go back in time to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington straightforwardly, as you do, in which the president has acted without the statutory authorization of Congress. Though everyone remembers that in the Constitution it says that Congress has the power to declare war. Please square the circle for me, Professor. Good evening to you.
Oh, good evening to John. It's not clear whether you can square the circle, whether the way critics of the Trump administration interpret the declare war clause, or the way critics of the Vietnam War during Johnson and Nixon interpreted the declare war clause, and 200 years of practice, and I think the original understanding of the Constitution. So one thing just to start out with, you clearly and correctly described the War Powers Resolution and its history. But it's a statute. It is the view of Congress. It can't rewrite the Constitution. We have to ask, what does the Constitution create first? And then what does the War Powers Resolution mean within that framework? To me, the War Powers Resolution, even in language you quoted, recognizes that presidents have some kind of inherent constitutional authority to use force abroad, even without congressional consent. Now, the War Powers Resolution says after 60 days, Congress orders the intervention to be over unless it gives subsequent approval, which creates what we call the 60-day clock. Now, President Nixon, he vetoed the resolution. It was passed over his veto, as you said, in 1973, maybe the nadir of presidential power in our lifetimes, and maybe in the last 100 years. Every president since Nixon has said that the War Powers Resolution is either unconstitutional or refused to obey it, or just acknowledged its existence, but never said they're bound by it. Because if they were to do so, they'd have to turn their backs, I think, on hundreds of years of practice. And I think this is where the real constitutional framework comes from, where presidents have used the armed forces that Congress has created to protect the country, to pursue our foreign policy goals, but always subject to Congress's power of the purse. Congress can always choose not to build the military presidents want, or Congress can always cut off funds right away if they don't like what the president's doing. That's how declared wars have ended, like the Mexican-American War of 1848 was ended by a funding cutoff. Or I think, unfortunately, the Vietnam War, American involvement was brought to an end by a funding cutoff by that basically the same Congresses that passed the War Powers Resolution in the first place.
I mentioned about the Vietnam War. My memory is the results of cutting off the funding and obliging the Ford administration essentially to withdraw. Mr. Nixon had left office in the middle of 74. What happened subsequent to that, I don't blame anybody, but I do know that the killing fields of Cambodia came out of the tragedy of the Vietnam War. and the U.S. was not present to stop it or to maintain stability in South Vietnam. That tumbled under the boot of the North Vietnamese, and Cambodia tumbled under the mad boot of Pol Pot. All very harsh memories. And Congress at that point was no longer talking about the disaster, but these many decades later, I mention it because of all the suffering. There's a detail here, John, in your National Review piece I ask you to speak to. I quote, Speaker Pelosi accused the president in 2020, after the Soleimani strike, accused the president of acting, quote, without respect for Congress's war powers granted to it by the Constitution, end quote. Is that a confusion of the Constitution and the War Powers Act?
I think that the War Powers Act and then Speaker Pelosi are confused. I don't think the constitutional framework is actually hard to discern. I think that presidents have long, from the beginning, from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to today, have carried out strikes like the Soleimani strike, have attacked, in Jefferson's case, the Barbary Pirates, or in Washington's case, sent the very small American army at that time off to fight the Indians on the frontier without congressional approval beforehand. I don't think that Speaker Pelosi can plausibly, although she clearly believes it, claim that the Constitution requires every time a president use force abroad, Congress has to give its approval, as if the president and Congress both had two keys to the nuclear missile and the submarine and have to turn them simultaneously. I think that's actually a mistake and a confusion because that's essentially how domestic policy works. Right? You want to pass Social Security, you want to pass a funding bill or a housing bill. Of course, Congress passes the law first. The president can veto it or sign it, and then the president carries it out. I think, though, that Pelosi's confused because that is not the way foreign policy and national security work. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, immediately from the very beginning of the country, realized that the presidency exists to act quickly and decisively first to national security threats. And then Congress always has the power to stop these initiatives, always has the power to block them if it chooses to use its power of the purse. But more often than not, and that's what I go through in the National Review piece too, John, is that Congress has ample opportunity, even now with the Iran strikes, has had and does have ample opportunity to use its funding power to shut the whole thing down if it really wants to.
Part of the challenge is to interpret when the United States is under threat. Because implicit in all of this is that the president is in the position as commander in chief. That's part of his writ. And commander in chief makes that call. I don't believe that he needs to consult with Congress before he decides that there's a threat to the United States. Does he, John?
I don't think so. And in fact, if you go back and look at the founding debates about why even to have a presidency, why create a single person in charge of the entire executive branch and then concentrate all of this authority in that office, as you said, the commander in chief power, the executive power, the power to enforce the laws. It was precisely because the founder said, Alexander Hamilton has a famous quote where he says, speed and decision and energy are what you find when one person has authority. When you start to disperse authority and responsibility, as you would with a legislature, then you can't act quickly. You take your time, you deliberate, which are important for certain kinds of government decisions. But Hamilton said when it comes to what he called protecting the community from attack, those are values that have to take a second seat to a single person acting quickly and decisively.
The Congress now is looking at an undetermined length of a conflict with Iran. And I believe it's not impossible to imagine the president going to them and asking for a declaration of war at any time of his choosing. Is that correct, John? There's nothing that keeps him back from that if he wants to.
No, and I think that's right, John. And I was in the Bush administration in the Justice Department in 2001 and 2002 when the president decided to seek authorizations from Congress before going into Afghanistan or before invading Iraq. And President Bush did not think he constitutionally needed it. But as you say, John, he thought it was good policy. He thought it was important for the country to hear the debate, for there to be a consensus in the country before a major military operation, but also to send a signal to our opponents that the country was unified. I would say here with President Trump and Iran, he has the ability to go ask for a declaration of war. But I bet he'll go to Congress even before that to get funding because modern war is so expensive that so many missiles are being fired, so much resources are being spended to keep two huge carrier battle groups operating right offshore that he needs to refill the coffers, and only Congress can do that.
I raise an example. John has many in his article at National Review Online. The one that comes to mind most readily is Libya. In the first and second administration by Barack Obama, the first administration, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, former First Lady, and subsequently a candidate for the presidency. The decision was made with the Secretary of State and the White House and National Security Advisor to enter into Libya at arm's length. The U.S. did not send a carrier group to attack Tripoli, but at arm's length, the Gaddafi regime was tumbled into the dustbin of history, and Gaddafi died at the hands of his enemies. Subsequent to that, Libya remains in a state of anarchy. And that anarchy is worth noting because Barack Obama, to my memory, paid no particular attention to what he had wrought in Libya, nor did the Congress object or make loud resolutions on the floor of the Congress and stir dissent across the land on television. I don't remember any of that. Now, maybe it happened and I wasn't paying attention, but it was during the first Obama administration, and I was on air every night, and there was no noise. So, John, the reason I raise this is I believe the same reason you raise all these examples. This looks like a partisan action by Congress, it does not look like a congressional action.
I quite agree, John. If you want to look at another example in the Middle East, the very same region, where the United States did something very similar, used air power to try to overthrow a regime and successfully did. It was President Obama in Libya in 2011. Congress did nothing except, again, use the power of the purse to make the operations possible by paying for all the munitions, paying for all the costs of war. But Congress never passed any kind of authorization
No.
of the kind that you're seeing people demand now in Congress with President Trump. And I might add, John, we've also talked on your show about Venezuela. Again, another example. President Trump didn't go to Congress for any kind of authorization of Venezuela. Again, the mirror image, 1989, President George H.W. Bush sent the military to Panama to capture Manuel Noriega, who was also accused of not just being the head of a country, but also a major figure in a drug cartel, just like Nicolas Maduro. In all those cases, people, courts didn't get involved to stop the war. The nation didn't throw the presidents out. Congress didn't impeach anybody. Congress's, I think, claim in the War Powers Resolution that you only get 60 days to, right, put troops on the ground or use forces in the air, right? They don't even believe that because Congress never does anything to enforce this claim it made in the War Powers Resolution that they have the right to authorize wars and presidents only have the right to carry them out.
Is the War Powers Resolution unconstitutional? Has it ever been challenged, John, to your knowledge?
I think it's unconstitutional. Or if you think about it, all it is a promise by Congress after 60 days that it's going to do something if the president uses force, but Congress never does. So it's never been successfully challenged or I'd say upheld in the courts. Here's the other interesting thing is I think the Constitution says that the president and Congress are to fight it out, to control war with their own constitutional powers and leave the courts out of it. And the courts have pretty much stayed out of it. The highest court to ever decide on this was the D.C. Circuit, which is the second highest court after the Supreme Court in the wake of the Kosovo War, which went beyond 60 days. Bill Clinton, another example of regime change from the air. no congressional approval. And the DC Circuit said, we can't get involved. This is what it called a political question for the branches to resolve. The judiciary has no role.
I mentioned, John, that there is a check on the president, and that's called the vote. And we have a midterm election. And that would be a place for those voices in the Congress, especially the Democratic voices, to bring forward to the American people their disagreement or dissent with the president's decision. Is that adequate for the Constitution's checks and balances?
John, you put your finger exactly on it. I think if you would ask the founders, what's the real check on any kind of president who's acting pretextually, who's, claiming a need to use force abroad, but is really doing it for adventures, for their own glory, they would have said the real check comes from elections. If you and you saw that during Vietnam, I think unfortunately so, but the American people, I think, elected a Congress in 74 and 72, and then obviously in 76 in response to the Vietnam War that led to the passage of the War Powers Resolution, led to a passage of a lot of these other Watergate statutes that tried to constrain the presidency. I think you saw it, remember in 2006, a Congress was elected that brought a Democratic majority in that opposed the Iraq War. And I think right now, if the Democrat Party wants to stop the strikes in Iran, wants to stop intervention in Venezuela, they can make that an issue in the midterm elections. And then if they win, they would have a mandate. And then they could use the power of the purse or their other legislative powers to try to draw those conflicts to a close.
There is a wonderful irony to the election of 74. I've always smiled about it. That was the victory and the entry into world affairs of a man named Joe Biden from Delaware, the election of 74, all these decades later. So we go back to the debate on television these next weeks, and we're going to hear lots of objections and lots of accusations against the president. That's the way of campaigning, John. I welcome it. Dissent was very helpful during the Vietnam War when I was a young person, because when you're 21 years old, you don't have a lot of information to decide which particular senator is speaking truth and which particular senator is speaking self-advantage. So we welcome the debate, John. I don't want to turn it off. And Congress has adequate means to go to the well of the Senate or the House and talk to the American people directly. Is that a correct check and balance, John?
I think that's ultimately what the founders wanted to be the check, was ultimately the American people through elections. And you're quite right. The Senate, the members of the House, they can have the debate on the floor. They just had one in the Senate. It failed to stop, right, the president's war in Iran. The Senate decided to turn down a resolution trying to end the Iran war. I don't think that should come as a surprise. The president's party is in charge of the White House and has a majority in both the House and the Senate. But in that debate, you have both sides of the argument about the wisdom of the Iran war. It will come again when President Trump, all reports suggest, is going to go back to Congress soon and ask for more money to continue the war in Iran, to restore all the dropping stockpiles of our forces there. You're going to have votes and a similar debate in the House too.
John Yoo, Civitas Institute, University of Texas, Berkeley Law. I'm John Batchelor.